Nighttime. Highway. I've seen this unraveling dream many times before. Endless distance flicking white stripes on a blacktop. Riding along. I sit in the shotgun seat, arms folded across my chest like an old Native American, staring out at the exit signs, the norths, the souths, backs and forths, criss and crosses, a life in between. I'm enjoying this. You know how to get it out of somebody. Every time I talk to you, I come up with something else that I remember. Now, some of it's not that pretty, but I'm proud of most of it. There's a lot to sort out, put it in perspective. I've been there, and I've been here, and wherever I'll be tomorrow. Sometimes I feel like I've gone around about twice. You're talking to a guy who never went to sleep. I've lived a couple of lifetimes. Maybe that's why I don't feel tired tonight. We can stay up late, watch the road, count off the miles. You want to get started? The storms boil up out of the west, a red-black cloud taking over the sky, streaming across the New Mexico border into Texas. You can stand there and watch them coming at you. Nothing to stop them on the high, open plains, 70, 80, 90-mile-an-hour wind, moving like a dark horse across the flat land, bringing sand and dust and tumbleweeds. I've seen chickens go to roost at noon, it'd be so dark. The wind howls through those old tar paper houses, and the sand sifts across the road till you can't tell where the blacktop begins, and the grit gets in your teeth. Now, many a time I'd be going home when I was a kid, running down the street, trying to beat the storm. I'd have to stop and grab hold of a pole to keep from getting blown away. Lonesome. Now, that's what Mama used to call the noise that the wind made. And it haunts me to this day. It sounds like the end of time. Sometimes I think I made music to shut out the wind, to find a place where the sands can't touch, and the air smells sweet and clear, like a spring morning after a rain. It rained a lot that spring I was born. More than 8 inches fell in 2 weeks before I arrived, bringing with it the hope of a bumper cotton crop and the toil of replanting. We were on the fringes, 7 or so miles northeast of Littlefield. On Tuesday morning, June 15th, 1937, Mama went up to the main farmhouse, owned by Mr. and Mrs. J.W. Bentner Sr., and birthed me. Daddy got to celebrate his first Father's Day that next Sunday. My coming wasn't recorded in the Lamb County News or Leader. Downtown, where Norma Shearer and Leslie Howard were starring in Romeo and Juliet, and the society pages were fussing about the Duchess of Windsor. They paid no notice to what was happening to us sharecroppers working in the field. Dirt poor, and we had the floor to prove it. We shared a 2-room house with my uncles and aunts and cousins. The bed was in the living room, and then there was the kitchen. 12 people. I don't know how we did it. My dad was the hardest working man I ever saw. He did everything at one time or another. He worked in the fields, ran a creamery, he owned a gas station, and drove a fuel truck. One time he broke his back. He had been working over in Hobbs, New Mexico, and a piece of lumber fell on him. He got out of the hospital in a back brace and immediately went and pulled cotton. It hurt so bad that he had to do it on his knees, but he wanted to get some money together so we could have a Christmas. It was never easy for our family, even after Mom and Daddy moved over to the Bentner farm. One time I remember my dad sitting in a chair and crying. His head was in his hands. Daddy had worked sun up, sun down on the farm and then milked 20 head of cattle, and we still didn't have anything to eat. $1 a day was what he made. Yet it wasn't a rare thing to see him laugh. He laughed a lot. When he smiled, the whole room lit up. Kids trusted him. My dad could walk up to a child and they might be bashful and shy and turning away. But in just a few minutes, they'd be right over there cuddling next to him. He was constantly joking. Daddy finally got him enough money together to buy a truck. He had a 41 Ford short bed, a bobtail they called them. We were doing all right for a while, even if Mama tells a story of how she had to put me up on the stove while she was cleaning the house to keep the rats from getting me. That's kind of country, ain't it? They were originally going to name me Waylon, W-A-Y-L-A-N-D, Land by the Highway, It's no wonder I've spent my life on the road. But when a Baptist preacher stopped by to visit Mama and said, "Oh, I see you've named your son after our wonderful Waylon College in Plainview," well, she immediately changed the spelling to Waylon. Now, we were solid Church of Christ, saved by baptism instead of faith. She never got around to switching it on the birth certificate. And for a while, I didn't like Waylon. It sounded corny and hillbilly to me. But it's been good to me, and I'm pretty well at peace with it now. When you're born in Texas, you think you're a little bit taller, a little bit smarter, and a whole lot tougher than anybody else. Now, when you get out in the world and find out you ain't, that's a grand awakening. It's a country unto itself. It really is, 'cause it's the only state that was a country before it was a state. And people who live there still feel that way. My wife Jessie hit it right on the head. She says they think the rest of the world is overseas. Of course, she's from Arizona, and she knows what it's like being around cowboys. We could just dream about being cowboys. For us, life on the farm was all we could look forward to. Littlefield is part of the Cotton Belt, and it sits astraddle the line between the dryland farming on the west side and wet irrigation on the east. And we pulled cotton all around Littlefield, getting up at 4 in the morning to be in the field before dawn. It would already be so hot and dry that the gnats would be swarming in your eyes, trying to get at the moisture. By the time the day was too hot for them, we'd be halfway down the row, hunched over, dodging snakes, pulling the bowls and chopping at them, trying to get to the other end where the water jar was. There's a saying, "He's in high cotton now," which means it's easier to pull or to pick it. You don't have to bend over. Now, for low cotton, which is thicker on the bush, well, you haven't lived till you've bent over all the way down the row, which is about 3/4 of a mile long, and then try standing up and straightening up your back. Or bending over to get the stuff, pulling a kid on a sack who's crying. My mama pulled bowls. We didn't pick it like they did in East Texas. We pulled the bowl and the cotton off the cotton stalk. Then we'd have the cotton gin that would separate the bowl from the seed. The bowl was green, and when it dried out, it would open up and be real brittle. It could really cut your hands if you didn't wear gloves. You know, there's nothing I've ever heard in my life as mournful as a whistle of an old freight train in the distance when you're kneeling down in a field. It sounds like death. Now, I'd be in the cotton patch dragging a 12-foot sack about half full, putting dirt clods in there to make it weigh more, and I'd hear that lonesome old howl. It goes right through you. I was sure that that train was on its way to somewhere, and I wasn't on it. I knew there's a better way somewhere. I didn't know where, but all I had to do was go looking for it. The last time I was pulling cotton, I was 16. I said, I didn't plant this shit, and I ain't gonna pull it up no more. And I quit. I left that sack sitting right in that field. It may be there to this day as far as I know. Mama worshipped her boys, and after my brother Tommy and me, quite some time after, along came James D., who was 8 years younger. And then Bo, who was born when I was 16. His name was Philip Doyle, but Daddy started calling him Bimbo because of a song by Jim Reeves that was out at the time. And he was Bo forevermore. Did you ever parch peanuts? Well, I used to sit around an old pot-bellied stove with my dad, putting peanuts in a pan and roasting them a little bit. We'd eat those peanuts and listen to the grand old Opry. And when Bill Monroe would sing, my dad would look at me and grin, 'cause he was his favorite. I was fascinated with the guitar as far back as I can remember. It was Mama that showed me the first few chords that I learned. She was real patient, sitting on the couch humming 30 pieces of silver and placing my fingers so I could change keys. Mama pulled cotton and bought me a guitar for $5. I guess it was an old Stella, or I don't even know if it had a name on it. She bought it from this guy named Weldon Tate. Then she ordered a guitar, a Harmony Patrician, and it came in time for Christmas. Tommy got a mandolin. I had that guitar for years. I even sanded it off one time and then put varnish on it, and ruined it, of course. I painted it and polished it, and put my name on it like Ernest Tubb had on his. School and I were destined not to get along. I never could seem to get much work done during the year, and I think I probably had some learning or comprehending difficulties. I was a terrible student, even though at the end of the year I'd work real hard and get the teacher on my side, and somehow I would pass. I lasted up to the 10th grade, and my dad had one thing to say about me leaving Littlefield High. If you're smart enough to quit school, you're smart enough to go to work. That probably saved my life. The rest of the guys who quit school usually got into a lot more trouble than I did. Down deep inside, I guess I regretted leaving almost immediately, because the first thing that I did was go out and buy a dictionary. But Daddy made me work, and when you're tired, you slow down a bit. You don't tend to get into as much trouble. I stocked shelves at a dry goods store. I was a projectionist at a Mexican movie theater, and I always got the reels mixed up. I unloaded Mack trucks at Piggly Wiggly's. I ran an air hammer at a paint and body shop. And I once got a job at a service station. I went to work about 6, and this guy came in and he wanted his oil changed. Well, I drained all the oil out of his car and replaced it with transmission fluid. After I got through, I looked around, realized what I'd done, and I just went home. I did that a lot. I was expelled from music class in high school for the lack of musical ability. And if they wanted a B flat, all they had to do was hand me a B and I'd flatten it out for them. I never learned to read music. But I couldn't think of anything else but being a musician. I took my guitar everywhere I went. I hung on to it for dear life. When relatives would come to town, I'd show up with my guitar, and I'd sing for them as long as they'd listen. I had a good ear, and sometimes, even after hearing a song only once, I could give it a whirl. Country music was looked down on when I was growing up. It was the music of the have-nots. Now, we may have had patched clothes, and we weren't invited to the right parties. Still, sitting around an old pot-bellied stove listening to the Opry, we had a kinship with the performers. I felt chills all over me the first time I heard Hank Williams sing Lost Highway. I'd stay up late on Saturday night listening for him, happy if I only heard him speak. I always wanted to be a singer, and he etched that in stone. I even had a premonition about him dying. I was in a drugstore downtown, and I put a quarter in a jukebox and played I'll Never Get Out of This World Alive. And I thought, wouldn't it be weird if he died with that record out? And he did. It tore me up terribly when I heard the news. It was like my world had come to an end. I was 16 years old and starting to take my guitar out in public. From family gatherings, I'd progressed to the youth center. I not only got to perform for the JCs and the Lions Club, they didn't pay me, though they'd say, think of the experience you'll get. But they did teach me how to eat with a fork. I'd used a spoon at home until I was about 12 or 13 years old. It was about then that I won my first talent show. Mama drove me over to Muleshoe, 30 miles west, and from there I made the rounds. When I sang Hey Joe over Channel 13 from Lubbock, my whole family went out to my Aunt Frida's to see it on TV. I won a watch, but I was so excited that it wasn't until I brought it home that I realized it wasn't working. It was empty inside, like those dummies that they put in the shop windows. I had to take it all the way back and get the real one. Now, without dances to play for, since kids might be tempted to have fun, most of my appearing was done at the Palace Theater on the Tuesday night local talent show. Now, you could win up to $25. I'd do 3 or 4 songs of my own, and I'd back up a couple of the other performers. Sometimes I played with James Jolly, who was about 3 or 4 years older than me, and actually wrote his own songs. I thought that was pretty neat, pretty unusual. Before I heard his Apple Blossom Time, I never thought about writing a song. I was also fixing to get married. Maxine Carol Lawrence lived out by Spade, and had won a local beauty contest and was a senior in high school there. She was a cheerleader, and she had black hair and pretty blue eyes, and I'd wait for her until the team bus got back after the football game. It was a typical West Texas courtship. I didn't have very much money, and I'd usually pick her up late so I wouldn't have to buy her a hamburger or something like that. Sometimes we'd go out and get a Coke, because she loved Cokes, and we'd sit there at the Chat and Chew or the Dairy Queen or Tasty Freeze and maybe spring for one of those foot-long hot dogs. Going with, as we used to say, steady. We were just kids. We had no idea what we were doing, before or after. And even though I had plenty of girlfriends, I was dumber than a rock when it came to women. Maxine thought she was pregnant. I couldn't even figure out how late she was. I never thought of leaving her. Hell, I'd already committed the ultimate sin from the way I was raised. We went ahead and we got married. And on our wedding night, she started her period. Now that's old country boy luck for you, ain't it? Still, there we were, already married, so I was going to make the best of it. The women gathered around and gave her a shower at the home of Mrs. R.C. Blevins on January the 5th, 1955. And we moved into a small house opposite the high school on North Lake. It was the same place I lived in as a kid. We had no idea of how to even get along. As far as being helpmates to one another, we'd get into a fight over the stupidest things. I'd think we was going to have Mexican food, and she'd make a hamburger casserole. It'd hurt both of our feelings, and for spite, we'd wind up throwing it out and going hungry. Hello, this is Waylon Jennings, coming over the voice of Lamb County, KVOW 1490 on your radio dial in Littlefield, bringing you 23 regularly scheduled newscasts a day. I was on the radio. I might not have been able to pronounce regularly, but for 6 hours from 4 in the afternoon till 10 at night, the airwaves were mine. Now, I had a 2-hour country show, and then another 2 hours of classics, where I had some more pronunciation problems, of course, and then another 2 of whatever was left over, waltz time, today's symphonies, or Montevani. KVOW specialized in block programming, which meant that you played all kinds of music. The whole station was held together with spit and baling wire, and I'd been working there since I was barely a teenager. By the time 1956 was underway, I was almost an old pro. I'd play the records, announce the ads, and sing along on the air. Now, a man named Ed Taylor loaned me an old Martin guitar, and I used to take requests from the listeners, even if sometimes I'd sing one song to the tune of another. Years later, Ed Taylor sent me the guitar, and I still have it. What if, I asked my dad one day somewhere around the 1950s, they mixed black music and white music, country and blues? Well, that might be something, my daddy replied. Then he went back to pulling transmissions. On a fall morning in 1954, listening to KVOW's Hillbilly Hit Parade, I heard that something. Elvis Presley was singing That's All Right, Mama and Blue Moon of Kentucky. Now, that sound went right straight up my spine. The way he sang, he sounded black, but something about the songs were really country. Maybe it was that old flapping of the big doghouse bass, all wood thumped, and the slapback echo on the guitars wailing and trailing away. It just went right through you. I was crazy about Elvis. I loved that churning rhythm on the bottom. He didn't even have drums yet, but that rock and roll part was unmistakable. On my own radio show, we used to do some rock and roll things like Chuck Berry and Ray Charles, Little Richard. Every time I played Little Richard's record, the owner would come all the way back out to the station from his house. He wouldn't even call. He'd just cuss me out until one night I played 2 in a row, and he fired me. My hero then was Sonny Curtis. He was so far advanced to what I was as a guitar player that I seemed to be struggling compared to him. His uncles were the Mayfield brothers, a bluegrass group, and Ed Mayfield had actually played with Bill Monroe's band. Sonny couldn't remember the time when he couldn't play a guitar. We had met when he used to come over to Littlefield to perform at the Palace. I'd do a few songs, and he'd do a couple more, and then we'd sing It's Been a Blue, Blue Day and collect our $10 and be on our way. We were all coming out of the woodwork. We'd seen most of us in small-town talent contests and country music shows in the area, and when KDAV in Lubbock started hosting a Sunday party, as early as August 1953, we got to meet each other on a regularly scheduled basis. Everybody had bands, and whoever booked the gigs would mix and match musicians. One night I was in a restaurant in Lubbock over on Avenue Q with Sonny Curtis and Weldon Myrick. We didn't have any money, and I'd hitchhiked to Lubbock. Sonny took the only nickel that was among us, put it in a jukebox, and pressed Chet Atkins' Poor People of Paris. Sonny could really play in that finger-picking style. I admired him so much that I wanted to change my name to Sonny one time. There was one other musician with us in that restaurant. His name was Charles Hardin Buddy Holly. Now, he didn't look like the type of guy that you'd expect to turn on the crowds, but I always enjoyed him as a performer. He wasn't impressive as a singer of country music, but man, the minute he hit that rock and roll, he was something else. Buddy called it Western and Bop, which could include everything from Annie Had a Baby, a rhythm and blues song that he heard coming out of Stan's record rack on KWKH Shreveport, Louisiana, to the country and western that sprouted out of the same town on the Louisiana hayride. Now, this new breed of country crossed all boundaries. They called it rockabilly, baby. Buddy's big break came at a Bill Haley concert in October of 1955 at the Fair Park Coliseum, when Lubbock's own Buddy, Bob, and Larry were discovered by Eddie Crandall of Decca Records. Brother Buddy was. Decca was probably looking for their own version of Elvis, who had just been signed to RCA Victor, and Buddy was it, even though they clearly didn't understand rock and roll, judging from Buddy's experience in Nashville. I thought about that years later, when I was making my first records there. Buddy's success gave us all hope. He appeared at the New York Paramount with Alan Freed and a caravan of teen idols, and was one of the first rock and rollers to write his own songs. Though he may have been inspired by Elvis, he knew there was already an Elvis. Buddy sounded like himself. His experience in Nashville, where they tried to change his unique style, had helped to make him more sure of what he was doing as an artist. And when he took the Crickets, J.I., and Joe B. Malden over to Norman Petty's studio in Clovis, New Mexico, he knew pretty much what he wanted from his music. He was ready for international stardom. Every time he'd come to town, he'd head up to see us at KLLL, the radio station in Lubbock where I was working at the time. Now that was his hangout. We'd lay back in the studio and play guitars, and Buddy would tell us stories. Our eyes would bug out of our head because he'd been all around the world. And he'd talk about people like the Everly Brothers and Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis. It was a way for him to unwind from things that were going on with the Crickets and Norman. Buddy had recently moved to New York, which kind of left the Crickets high and dry. Experimenting with strings and newer arrangements, like he did on I Guess It Doesn't Matter Anymore, didn't help a lot. There was a big distance between Texas and New York, and Buddy wanted to be close to his publishing company and record company. J.I. and Joe B. also didn't like the fact that Buddy was talking about starting a label of his own, and they didn't have a share in it. They were used to getting a third of everything. The new company would be called Taupe, after the reddish-brown color of the Cadillac that Buddy drove. Its first artist was going to be Waylon Jennings. Buddy had decided to record me that past summer. He could see how much music meant to me, and maybe he related my yearning desire to himself, growing up in the sun-baked West Texas town with music as its only outlet. On September the 10th, he took me over to Clovis to do my first session, and it was an unnerving experience. I was musically naive. I had no earthly idea how things were done, and I thought you just went over and cut a record, and you were automatically a hit. I didn't know that studios and producers had that much to do with it. All I knew was that Buddy Holly had befriended me and taken me under his wing. Still, I couldn't have been more surprised when Buddy walked into the station one day. He pitched me an electric bass guitar and told me you got 2 weeks to learn to play that thing. He had taken a 3-week tour starting in January 1959 because Norman had his money all tied up, close to $100,000 worth that he'd put in some church trust fund. Petty had talked the Crickets into staying with him, and they had officially called it quits, though I think both sides felt kind of bad about it. Now, Buddy was hurt and mad, but he needed a band. He chose me and guitarist Tommy Alsop, who had come down from Tulsa with Western swing influences that he had learned while playing with Bob Wills, and Odessa drummer Carl Goose Bunch. There we were in a photo booth at Grand Central Station. Buddy and I smoking cigarettes. He had his glasses on, and I had my sunglasses and trench coat on. I smoked Salem's. Buddy was trying to quit smoking, but actually he just quit buying them. But he liked to bum them off of me. "Waylon, give me a Salem," he'd ask, and I'd flip him one over. The winter dance party was about to head out of town. Stars in person read the ads. Buddy Holly and the Crickets, though that upset Buddy, since the Crickets were back in Lubbock. The Big Bopper, Dion and the Belmonts, Richie Valens, and Frankie Sardo, in that order. Opening night was at George Devine's Ballroom in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on January the 23rd. And the tour would run for 25 straight shows and wind up in Springfield, Illinois on February the 15th. There wasn't a night off to be had, crisscrossing the upper Midwest in a bus in the middle of winter. It was so cold on that bus, we'd have to wear all of our clothes, coats and everything. My feet were constantly frozen. I couldn't believe how cold it was. I wasn't used to that. When we'd get to the show, I'd run off the bus holding my breath because it would freeze my lungs. We'd change in the dressing room, go on, get all sweated up, and then run back to the bus. We tried to hang our wrinkled suits in the aisle, and after a while it got kind of ripe in there. We smelled like a bunch of billy goats. It was a fast-paced show. I've seen a series of photos taken in Fort Dodge, Iowa on January the 30th, which shows a clock in the background. By 9:30, Frankie would be on stage. 15 minutes later, J.P., dressed in a full-length leopard skin coat that stretched to his knees, hit the spotlight. The Big Bopper had a country show more than anything, which you might expect from someone who wrote White Lightning for George Jones. The Belmonts were grouped trio style around an old Shure microphone when the clock struck 4 minutes of 10, and was still there at 3 minutes past. Richie came on next doing his Donna and La Bamba hits. 10-10. Buddy would close the show, and we'd play close to an hour, including some of his biggest songs and some others, like Salty Dog Blues, the old bluegrass song, and Gotta Travel On. He held a definite charisma on that stage. The audience might start off dancing, but by the end, they'd be all jammed up in front, shouting his name, rocking and screaming their heads off. It would really pump up the adrenaline. The shows drew great crowds, 1,000 or more at each stopover. We'd pull up in the bus and there'd be a line 2 blocks long waiting to get in, standing in the cold, 40 below. We'd wander back and forth between Wisconsin and Minnesota, Eau Claire and St. Paul. Now, I've often wondered what Buddy saw in me. He really liked me, and I could tell. Now, toward the end, I was probably closer to him than anyone, but I was green as a gourd. I hadn't been anywhere. As a bass player, I must have been terrible. I was a pretty good harmony singer, but people didn't come to see Buddy for the backup vocals. He talked to me all the time about music. I think maybe it was like looking in a mirror, reminding himself of things that he had learned along the way. Maybe he could see how hungry I was and how much I cared about being a singer. Waylon, he'd say, you don't ever have to restrict yourself to being a country artist, because you can cut rock records or pop records if you want to. He'd tell me about not getting locked in and developing a style. I learned so damn much about rhythms from him, and not overstaying your welcome, and not compromising. Don't ever let them tell you what to do, he emphasized. If people ask you, tell them you're pop. That gives you room to move. Don't say rock and roll and don't say country. He'd had a dose of Nashville, where they wouldn't let him sing it the way he heard it and wouldn't let him play his own guitar parts. Can't do this and can't do that. Don't ever let people tell you that you can't do something, he'd say. And never put limits on yourself when it comes to music. Don't back up. Years later, I'd be in the studio and the track would really be in the pocket and feeling good. And I'd hear a Nashville producer say, "Man, that sounds like a pop hit." And I remember Buddy talking to me, telling me that they thought he was crazy as the freezing bus moved down the highway from Green Bay, Wisconsin to Clear Lake, Iowa. The Surf Ballroom was packed 1,500 strong. Even though it was a Monday night, it seemed like half of the town's teenagers had turned out. The show had been scheduled to start at 8, but we didn't get off of the bus until 6 in the evening. We were so cramped that it was almost a relief to get on stage and shake our bodies loose. The next night, we were due in Moorhead, Minnesota, over 400 miles northwest. Now, if we were lucky, and the bus didn't break down again, we might get there by tomorrow afternoon. Buddy was exhausted, and we didn't have a clean shirt among us. He asked me and Tommy if we'd like to go along with him on a charter flight and fly ahead of the troop to Minnesota, so we could hopefully get some sleep and do a little laundry before the next night's show at the Armory in Moorhead. We agreed, and the dance hall manager made the arrangements for the Dwyer flying service at the Mason City Airport to fly to Fargo, North Dakota, across the river from Moorhead. A young pilot by the name of Roger Peterson signed on for the flight, with takeoff set for after the show at 12:30 a.m. In between acts, the Big Bopper came up to me. He was a large man, at least 250 pounds, and he could hardly fit, much less sleep, on the seats of the bus. He had been really sick with the flu. "Buddy's chartered a plane for you and Tommy," he told me. "Waylon, would you mind letting me take your seat?" Heck, I was skinnier than a rail, and I could sleep anywhere. I was excited to be on the bus with the other performers. So I said, "Sure, but you have to talk to Buddy. And if it's okay with Buddy, it's okay with me." Across the room about the same time, Richie Valens and Tommy Alsop were flipping a coin to see whether Richie might take Tommy's seat on the plane. Tommy called tails and lost. The next thing I know, Buddy sends me to get a couple of hot dogs, and he's sitting there in a cane-bottom chair leaning back against the wall and laughing. And he said, "You're not going with us tonight, huh? What'd you do, chicken out?" I said, "No, I wasn't scared, but the Big Bopper just wanted to go." "Well," he said, grinning, "I hope your damned old bus freezes up again." And I said, "Well, I hope your damned old plane crashes." It took me a lot of years to get over that. I was just a kid, barely 21. I was about halfway superstitious. Like all Southern people, I was scared of the devil and scared of God equally. I was afraid somebody was going to find out that I had said that and blame me. I knew I had said it. I remember Buddy laughing as he headed out for the airport after the show. I was certain I caused it. The next morning was sunshine and kind of warm. It was a little after 10 when we pulled into Moorhead. I'd been in the back of the bus sleeping all night long. We were parked in front of the hotel. The tour manager went in and hurried back out. He said, "Waylon, come here. I've got to talk to you." I knew something was wrong. I didn't know what, except that it was probably bad news. I could hear it in his voice, and I said, "No." That's all I said, just no. I turned to Tommy and said, "You go." Tommy went outside and came back in a little bit later and said, "Boys, the guys didn't make it. Their plane crashed." It was just chaos. Buddy didn't have a chance in that plane. They were flying into a blizzard, and the pilot had not been checked out on instruments. There were some rumors that the instruments on the plane were reversed of what they were used to. They thought they were going up when they were really going down. They knocked snow off of the roof of a house about a mile back. Maybe if they hadn't hit a fence post, they might have landed. I had no intention of ever playing another guitar or singing another note. I'd known very few people who had died. It really broke me up, and it seemed like of all the people on the tour, me included, fate had picked the best ones and killed them. My whole world really was destroyed for a while. I didn't know what I was going to do. I thought it was all over for me, even though I was the center of attention. Everybody wanted to talk about the crash and why I gave up my seat to the Big Bopper and what Buddy was like in his final hours. But I didn't have anything to say. How could I? He was the first person to believe in me, and he was my friend. All I could think about was what a good soul he was and what a happy man he was. He loved living. He was in love with his wife and in love with his music. He was so young, and to this day I still don't think it was fair. I went back to work at KLLL, but I was useless. All the sparkle had gone out of me. I was supposed to be the wild man, disc jockey, so I couldn't turn it on the way I used to. Even if I'd play Buddy's records, I wouldn't say much. I'd lost my center of gravity. I wasn't worth shooting. Two old friends, Sky and Slim Corbin at the station, tried to help me, but the only one that made any sense was an old disc jockey named High Pockets. He could see that I was all messed up and that I was feeling guilty because I was the one who survived. One day he sat down and talked to me. "Now, what makes you think you're so powerful that you could cause something like that?" he said. "And if you could bring them back here right now, make them alive and standing in this room, would you do that?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Can you do that?" And I shook my head, no. "Well, you couldn't kill them either. You couldn't even will them to die. You don't have that ability." High Pockets had to get down on that level to make me understand. I had to admit that he was right. He was kind of an old country philosopher, though he liked playing the fool sometime. Every once in a while he'd hit on something that would raise the top of my head off. speaking with the simple honesty and wisdom of a man who homespun records and jockeyed discs. It made me feel like maybe my life could begin again. I came home. I'd been out working, and I was probably late. Maxine was standing on a chair with a necktie around her neck, tied to a light bulb. As I walked through the door, she jumped. Of course, the light bulb broke, and she collapsed on the floor, still alive. Now, I don't know what she was trying to prove, but I did know she couldn't have been serious. It seemed more like a sick joke or something. She had a strange temper, and by this time we both knew that we'd never get along. Maxine and I should never have married. I hardly knew her. We were just kids, and pretty soon we started having kids. I was 19 when Terry, our oldest, was born, on January the 21st, 1957, and Julie Ray followed a year and a half later, August the 12th, 1958. Buddy came along on March the 21st, 1960. We both loved the children, but they were all we had in common, and I felt trapped. Each time that we thought we were going to get out of the marriage, that we'd had enough of driving each other up the wall, we'd have another kid. I didn't see any way out, and it wasn't all her fault. I was doing my share of messing around, a hot-shot disc jockey with a lot of leftover guilt. I wanted to do the right thing, and I was determined to see the family through, even though I was on a downhill slide that kept getting steeper. Things were just going from bad to worse. I thought that I'd made a good try, but it just wasn't meant to be. My hopes had been in one basket, and even though I'd gone back to life as it had been before Buddy, it just wasn't the same. Especially since he was my friend. Now, what if he'd have been my brother? I don't see how you can get blindsided by some of the things fate hands you and come back from them. It was all too sudden, and I got to where I just didn't give a damn. There was a little irresponsibility in me, and I needed more money. Now, they were kind of struggling at KLLL, and I didn't think they were, even though they really were. They offered me more money at our competition, KDAV, quite a bit more. I got mad and quit and went over to the other side. That didn't work out at all. I didn't fit over there. They were from the old school, and I was a foreigner in their eyes, and my own probably as well. So in the middle of the night, I left for Arizona. Maxine's dad got real sick, and we went out to see him. He lived in Scottsdale, and she had a sister living in Coolidge. It was the first time that I'd been that far west, and it really took hold of me. In Coolidge, I went back to playing music at a place called the Galloping Goose with a pair of local boys, Billy Joe Stevens and Claude Henry. Now, I was big time when they found out that I'd been with Buddy Holly. I probably made as much money as they did, which was $15 a night. If I'd tried to be a rock and roll singer, it would have never worked out. I was married for a start with 3 kids, and I didn't feel young. And though I thought it was awful cool for girls to be screaming at us on stage like that, it also frustrated me. Even back then, I wanted people to listen. Now, make no mistake that they were getting their chance now, here in Dove Creek, Colorado. I'm on top of a snack bar dressed in a blazer with some kind of an emblem on it, and Billy Joe was playing lead guitar. I'm strumming rhythm. And behind us is a drummer that we hired for the night from a local strip joint. I told Billy Joe every time I sang White Lightning, I seemed like I wanted to take my clothes off. I did that for a whole summer, round and around and around. Finally, I said to hell with this, and I headed for Salt Lake City. Billy Joe went with me. We got a job in a place called the Esquire Lounge. Billy Joe and I walked in and asked to play there, and the manager hired us, though it was a Dixieland joint. Now, that is, she hired me. Her name was Lynn Mitchell, and she was to become my second wife. I stayed up in Salt Lake City for a couple of months. Then I moved back to Coolidge, until a better gig came along in Phoenix at a steakhouse called Wild Bill's. The next thing I know, along came Lynn again. She had followed me down to Arizona. Lynn was about 8 or 9 years older than me, and I never met anybody quite like her. She had a spirit to her that I couldn't see in Maxine. They were like night and day. Lynn liked to mix it up with the boys, outgoing and gone. She worked in bars, and she gave as good as she got. Maxine had had her fill of life in Coolidge. She was going to force my hand. I don't like it here. I'm leaving, and I'm taking the kids with me and going back to Texas. By then, baby Dina was on the way. Now, she knew I loved them, but I couldn't stand her. We were nothing alike. And finally, she moved back to Texas and took the kids, and that was the end of it, and the end of our marriage. Now, her leaving just pushed me and Lynn together. Maxine had done pretty much what I wanted her to, even though I hated to see the kids leave. I knew I hadn't been a good husband to her at all, and I can't tell you one way we were compatible. We never belonged together. I moved over to Frankie's, an old bar which could hold about 90 people on Thomas Road. Billy Joe didn't seem to have the drive for it, and I was going broke in Phoenix. I got a starter Fender guitar and a little amplifier and started performing on my own. There wasn't more than 20 people in Frankie's every show when I began. One night a guy came up to my corner of the riser, which served as a stage, and asked to sit in. He was a heavy-set guy, and he held a guitar left-handed. He wanted so bad to play, even though he worked at a shoe store in the daytime, and would be so tired that he'd almost be asleep on stage, leaning against a piano. We played 4 hours, from 9 to 1. Now, I didn't pay Jerry Gropp anything for a while, and then I got to paying him about $15 a week, I think. I taught him to do what we call the rickety rack, a fast rhythm with straight eights. He was good, and pretty soon he got better than me. His cousin, Ed Metzendorf, was also left-handed. He had a Dan Electro bass. I think I taught him how to play that as well. I had these two guys, and each with their guitars pointing the wrong way, so I looked like the one that was out of place. And I taught them to play in my style. We were a band. At least the start of one. Playing every night was good for me, too. We did everything from rock and roll to country to pop ballads, and the late-night bar crowd started to grow each week. As a singer, I have a wide range, even though I don't have a falsetto. I could sing as high as Roy Orbison, but he couldn't sing as low as me. Pretty soon we were back at Wild Bill's, which probably held about 100 people. It had high ceilings and sawdust on the floor and a Western-type atmosphere that brought out the cowboys. Lynn worked there. She'd always have to go to work early and set up, and I'd be eating bologna sandwiches at home alone. They served dinners till 9, and then I'd go on. They had a huge dance floor, and I couldn't play the races on enough. 2 building contractors dropped in one Saturday and saw the place wall to wall with people, and they started coming around. They liked my music a whole lot. They were about to build a club for a man named Jimmy D. Musil, who had a part ownership in another place across town called Magoo's. He had a business falling out, and his ex-partner, Bob Sikora, kept Magoo's. J.D. hired these old boys to build him a double-decker club on Scottsdale Road just over the Tempe line, down on the river bottom. Now, there was to be music upstairs and downstairs would have the capacity of about 300 people. Upstairs could fit about 4 times that many. Now, Jim said if I signed a contract to play there regularly, then he'd design the club around me. J.D.'s was automatically a smash. People were trying to get in that club every night of the week. I was the honcho, and it put me on the map. We were closed on Sundays and had about a half a house on Monday, but from Tuesday on through the week, it was packed. J.D.'s gamble had paid off like a slot machine. Now, that's where I saw I needed drums. I'd met Richie Albright through Tom Grassel, who hung out at a bar on Whiskey Row in Prescott. Richie didn't keep straight time, but he was a senior's drummer. He could keep that rolling rhythm going. I took him back to the bass drum and the snare. I hadn't been used to drums, so I said just hit the foot and the snare, and don't put anything else in there until I tell you. Gradually, we kept adding other pieces of the kit, the toms, the hi-hat, and cymbals. But we made sure that the rhythm kept pumping. Richie played with a lot of up kicks, the ands of the beat. And gradually we found our own style. The music started coming together at J.D.'s. On the weekends we'd play afternoons as well as after hours. At night we played 4 sets. In the first I wouldn't do dance music, and people would come out and sit for the opening hour and watch. Now, by the second set, they'd start dancing, and I'd be talking to them, having fun, just like I used to do on the radio. It wasn't that hard. Being funny was my second nature. Of course, being sexy was my first. Most of the material we did at J.D.'s was covers, but I still thought that writing a good song was one of the most satisfying things that you could do. If a song says what you want it to say at the end and draws a mental picture, There are few things in life that can make you feel more creative. When Don Bowman, a San Diego disc jockey who had worked with me at KLLL, called and asked if I might want to help him write some songs, I thought I might give it a chance. We'd gone our separate ways, and I was impressed with how far he had traveled. He had signed a contract with RCA to put out an album composed of mostly novelty songs, including Chet Atkins' Make Me a Star. He heard that I was playing around Phoenix and was curious to know if I wanted to collaborate. About the first thing that he brought over was Just to Satisfy You. He had a verse and no melody, and we went right to work on it and finished it. It happened so quick, I thought this thing can't be any good. We wrote several things together, and I learned a lot from Don Bowman. He taught me that you have to have humor, whether or not the song itself is funny. Now, if you get too damn serious, it becomes work. Every once in a while, we'd get hung up on a phrase, and I'd go to the bathroom to take a leak, and while I was in there, I'd think of a line. We call that a bathroom line. Don was friendly with Jerry Moss in Los Angeles. He took some of my demos over to him. Jerry was just starting A&M Records with Herb Alpert, a trumpet player who had struck gold a year before with the Lonely Bull. Jerry and Herb decided that they'd like to try something with me. On July 9th, 1963, a contract arrived at 2022 North 36th Street, apartment B1 in Phoenix, giving me a 5% royalty rate for two sides of a single, Love Denied and Rave On. The flip was the Buddy Holly song, while Bill Tillman wrote Love Denied. It had a real high ending, almost like Roy Orbison. I think that's one of the things that Herb and Jerry were impressed with, my range. Herb and Jerry brought me out to Los Angeles and did something in that vein, a version of Ian Tyson's Four Strong Winds. We backed it with a Just to Satisfy You. Herb kept looking for something in me that he couldn't find. It just wasn't there. We cut 12th of Never, Kisses Sweeter Than Wine, Don't Think Twice, It's All Right. And for a third single, Sing the Girls a Song, Bill, back with The Race Is On. A&M released my 345s during 1964, one every couple of months from April to October, which helped my popularity at JD's, but it didn't make much of an impact anywhere else. Sing the Girls a Song, Bill, was a radio hit in Nashville. It gave me some credibility. Though, if I could use any encouragement, all I had to do was look out at JD's nightly throngs to know that I was doing something right. I just needed to figure out a way to capture it on record. More problems in marriage are brought about by insecurity than anything else, I think. For Lynn, the more popular that I got, the more she suspicioned it was turning my head around. I'm sure there were moments that she could just feel me slipping away. I brought out what I called the Marine Sergeant in her. She was one of those people who could get mad and stay angry for 2 weeks, never speaking to you, even though you were in the same house. She had strength and meanness mixed up, always unsure of herself and her grip on me. Now, things were starting to roll my way, and there were more demands on my time. It couldn't have been easy, but her way of holding on was to dig in and ridicule me. She was afraid of seeming vulnerable. It got worse when Maxine sent the kids to live with us. Now, I was trying to do the best I could. Still, I couldn't get any cooperation out of Lynn. She would not accept children by another wife in the house. Lynn had a miscarriage before we were married. She had nephritis, which was a kidney disease, and when she got pregnant, we had to have an abortion to save her life. It was our most tender moment together. I really felt bad for her. She wanted a baby more than anything, and the loss really affected her. I don't think she felt like she was a full woman, and maybe she hoped that that might cement our relationship, to have a child that was truly ours. We brought Tommy Lynn home to our apartment when she was just 3 days old. Through friends, we found a girl who was going to have a baby and not keep it. I knew the mother, and Lynn knew the mother. She had become pregnant by a married man, and financially and circumstantially could get no support from the father. We arranged the adoption through a lawyer. We were doing quite well. At JD's, I was taking home over $1,000 a week, and I was able to buy my first brand new car that I had ever owned, a 1964 Chevrolet. As a family, we moved over to Pierce Street, then we got a house in Scottsdale on East Amelia right off of Indian School Road, a bigger house. We needed the room because my kids from Maxine had arrived. They were a little confused by the new situation, though they tried not to show it. I'm sure that my separation from their birth mother hurt them a lot, dividing their little loyalties, but they seem resilient enough. Like most kids from broken homes, I think they always hoped that it might miraculously be changed back. But there wasn't much chance of that. They were happy to see me anyway. They'd come running up the walk and throw their arms around me while Lynn watched from the side, giving me the cold shoulder and inwardly fuming. Lynn would show all the love in the world to Tommy Lynn, and none to my other children. She'd make them stay outside all day and only come in to play in the family room or their bedroom and eat in the kitchen. She hated it that they were there. All of her attention was on her little girl. Lynn would cuddle her and kiss on her and never pay any attention to the other children except to correct them, holler at them, or tell them to go to bed. She could never speak kind to them. All she did was scold. I thought, this can't go on, so I called Maxine and I told her I was going to send the kids back. And I bought her a brick house and filled it with new furniture, packed up the kids' clothes and toys in a trailer. I kissed Terry and Julie and Buddy goodbye, but for how long I couldn't tell. My brother took them back to Texas, and the night they left I sat up crying and didn't go to bed at all. The next morning Lynn came over to me and I was still sitting in the chair all red-eyed. We hadn't even spoken for 2 weeks. "Hon, don't be sad," she said. "Everything's going to be all right. Don't you worry. We'll make it just fine." I looked at her and I said, "If you'd have called me a rotten son of a bitch or told me to fuck off or something like that, you might have been able to hold on to me, but there ain't a chance. I'll never live with you again." And I got up and left. I met Barbara at the Cross Keys, long blonde hair and pretty blue eyes and built like you wouldn't believe. Richie was the only unmarried man in the group. She became friendly with him so she could always be around. Pretty slick, huh? But he was just an excuse. Barbara Roode had her eyes on me, and I wasn't exactly blind either. We stayed away from each other as long as we could. We talked some, but we never did anything. Finally, I went to Houston to have some talks with the record label there, and she came down. It was the first time we were together. Now, she was never comfortable with what we were doing, and neither was I. Still, it was hard to keep away, and we started seeing each other on the sly. I'd have to go over to her house in the daytime. Barbara was a golden girl and a dear heart. Her dad had invented a cotton machine that picked up cotton between the rows that the bowl puller would miss. He was worth about $30 million, I guess, and she had a lot of money. She even bought a car the same color of mine. She was definitely more of a party girl than Lynn. I wrote Anita, You're Dreaming about her when we first got together. I had most of it done, and Don Bowman helped me finish it. I was telling her that it didn't look like I was ever going to get loose from Lynn. She was young and deserved a better deal than I could offer. She was dreaming if she thought it could ever happen. But dreams have a way of revealing the truth. And when I left Lynn, I went straight to Barbara. That wasn't the only fantasy crossing the line into reality. Don became friends with Bobby Bear, who had scored hits with 500 miles away from home in Detroit City. Now, Bowman was telling him about me, and he got to find out for himself when he was driving through Phoenix one night, and he heard Just to Satisfy You on the radio. They brought the record back to his producer in Nashville, Chet Atkins, and said he wanted to record it. Now, Chet was familiar with Just to Satisfy You because Don Bowman had been bugging him with it. But he turned it over and said, hell, this is the one I want to do. So they wound up doing both. Four Strong Winds was on the other side, and it turned out to be a big hit for Bobby. The next time Bobby came through Phoenix in November 1964, he headed over after his gig to J.D.'s, and we did a duet of Just to Satisfy You. He had the next day off, so he came over to see me and the band play. Somewhere between Phoenix and Las Vegas the next day, he got to thinking about it, and he stopped at a payphone. Chet, he said, I've just seen Waylon, and he's the best thing since Elvis. Now, he's so good that he deserves to be on a major label. Chet had heard similar praises from Skeeter Davis, who had called him at home to tell him he should sign me, and Dwayne Eddy. It wasn't like an agent or a manager coming in and hyping somebody. That don't mean too much. But coming from Bobby Bear, who liked country and folk and had been a part of rock and roll, the recommendation really meant something. We loved the same songs. Bobby gave Chet my phone number. To be on RCA and have Chet Atkins produce you, to have him call you and tell you that he'd like to sign you, and never even seen me, I'll never forget the day. I was sitting home, and I could hear this real kind, gentle voice on the other end of the phone. And he was saying, "We sure would like to have you on RCA. Would you be interested?" Would I be interested? It was impossible to say no. That was the ultimate. RCA, or Victor. I'd seen it on so many Jimmy Rogers and Carter Family 78s. RCA meant country music, almost from the very beginning, dating back to Bristol, Tennessee sessions, organized by Ralph Peer in 1928. And Chet Atkins was a legend. Not only was he a well-regarded A&R executive, but he could put a gold seal on your career. He was a musician's musician, an originator who had his own Gretsch guitar named after him, the country gentleman. He was Sonny Curtis's idol.